So we can actually, if you want to, Jacob, do you want to tilt these a little bit? So
I can do whatever, yeah. Should we pull it out a little? Yeah. That's a good idea.
Just kind of look at Lauren.
All right.
Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute when our final panelist rejoins us.
Should we turn these on? Is this
Should be
on?
awesome.
Should I?
Yeah. Yeah, it must have to be working.
Hello.
Thanks for being here, everybody. How's everybody?
Good.
Is everyone having a good New Voices Festival?
Yes.
I'm so glad. Thanks for being here for the final day of the New Voices Festival. We have a lot happening today for the final day, including this panel right now, which we'll get started in just a moment. We also have another panel this afternoon at 2 o'clock. Let me see if I can remember the long title. Final Girls, Drama Queens, Final Girls and Femme Fatales. Performing gender in theater and cinema, featuring our other writers who aren't present here today. So if you would like to hear from the rest of our writers, please join us later this afternoon. And then this back here in the same spot. And then again, back here in the same spot at 5 o'clock this evening, so a little bit different time than yesterday. We also have our final reading with Jenn Shapland and Lauren Oyler, who are on the panel today, and Alexandra Queenan will be reading again tonight here at 5 o'clock, and books will be on sale. And then our final event of the New Voices Festival is a staged reading of Liza Birkenmeyer's play, Dr. Rides at American Beach House, which is at the Cherry Art Space on Cherry Street. We hope that you can make it. If you want to go and you don't have a ride, let somebody in a blue t-shirt know. We would be glad to make sure that you can get over there. That takes place right after the reading, so we'll head over there for the final event. So with that, I'm going to introduce today's moderator, Jacob White, who's my colleague in the Department of Writing. He's a fiction writer, and he will be leading this. Very grateful for Jacob to step in today and have a conversation with our writers, Lauren Oyler, who's joining us from Berlin. Hi, Lauren. Can you hear us?
I can hear you great. Thanks.
Great. And then we have Jenn Shapland and Maya Phillips. Can we give them all a round of applause?
Hi. I've been, first of all, I just want to again thank all of our New Voices writers and all of these outstanding New Voices Festival students for making this happen, for coming and sharing your time and imagination with us. I feel super, super honored and really just excited to be able to talk with the three authors that we have today, Maya Phillips and Jenn Shapland and Lauren Oyler. I've been thinking a lot about the works of these writers, you know, so much so that it's almost guaranteed that I'll forget what I want to say because I have so much that I would love to talk about. But luckily, the students and the New Voices Festival class have also prepared a lot of really thoughtful questions that I'll rely on, and so we'll hopefully get to hear all kinds of questions for y'all. But thank you again. I guess one reason that I'm so excited about these particular books, you know, given the theme of this panel, is that they all deal with the authorial subject in kind of intentional ways, and they all push against the kind of a silent agreement of certain genres to position itself in different ways within a text to complicate the story that a text tells about itself. And I'd like to maybe start with that and ask how each of you think about the ways in which you have to push against certain parts of your genre to, or even the idea of a genre to tell the story of the self. I mean, the English critic Frank Kermode has this term, instructive dissonance, where he talks about the novel's job is to create this instructive dissonance between, like the human mind and the contingency and chaos as things as they are in the world. And part of these texts' pleasure, part of their vitality, I think, comes from letting some of that contingency, some of that instability of the self into them. So I guess I'll just start by asking, each of you to just talk a little bit about, ways in which you make the process of your writing kind of part of the story, and ways in which your writing becomes kind of about rethinking the way that you write about the self and construct the self on the page. Does that make sense? Maybe? Maya, do you want to start?
Okay, let me see if I can make this sound smart. I guess, in poetry, especially in writing this book, I was very aware. One of the teachers in my program, the founder of the program, was Ellen Bryant Voigt, and she's written a lot about the lyric eye and what that means in work. And various people have different definitions of what that is, and like the definition of a lyric versus kind of like an epic poem form, which is what I was working in mostly. And it's kind of, I guess it was kind of closer to, I guess, what fiction writers, I don't remember what fiction writers have, the third person omniscient, am I using the right, no, not second person, third person, right?
First
Person? No, I don't. Anyway, I was an omniscient presence in the book, and I wanted to be that. I think I talked about this a little bit yesterday, but I wanted to place myself as a character who's kind of an onlooker. So in some points, I put myself in a character of Telemachus in the kind of structure of the mythology I'm working in. And in some points, I'm just like, the kind of Homer figure, the storyteller. And I'm also inhabiting different characters throughout. There is a kind of fluidity with me and my presence as a narrator that, I'll slip into the character of like the other woman, or like Medea, or Circe, or something like that. Because I think that even though the main idea of my project is to kind of memorialize this father figure, I'm also revealing myself subtly through these other characters without being explicitly like, I feel this, because that wasn't super interesting to me, honestly. I respect that form, but with this, I think using the kind of structure of epic poetry was a way for me to access my own experiences and like use that as a vehicle to like reveal myself, if that makes sense. I need to stop rambling.
Rambling is where it's at. Jen, you want to?
Sure. This is this on?
Not sure, actually.
I'm not sure either. Doesn't really sound like it.
It says it is.
I'll just talk kind of loud.
I can hear you.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I think in my book, I really thought I was setting out to write about someone else, but at the same time, I was really interested in what autobiography was. What does it mean to tell your own story? To what extent can we do that? How can we be honest when we do that? And so in the process of kind of reading McCullers' letters and her therapy transcripts, things like that, things in the first person, I felt like I was able to get closer to the story that she was trying to tell about herself. But at the same time, there were so many gaps and absences in the archive that I started to basically fill in those gaps with my own life. And so I was talking about this with some students before we walked over here, that I really started to treat my own life as research material, and to think of myself as almost like another source, like another something I was coming across in the archive. So I guess for me, it never felt like, oh, like this is me like really telling my own story, but more like this is me using the found material of my life to help enhance the story that I'm trying to tell. And so like in that way, I think genre really kind of has a lot to do with the way the eye can come in. And for me in biography and in academic writing, in which I was being trained at the time that I was writing the book, the eye didn't really play much of a role, or didn't have a role, at least in the forefront of the writing. And I definitely wanted to, like I said yesterday, include myself in the frame as I was looking at these various objects, stories from history.
Thanks a lot. Lauren?
Yeah, so I think when I started writing fake accounts, which if you've read it, this is going to sound strange, but I really wasn't so worried about expressing myself, and I wasn't thinking about the self as sort of like a theme, because I think when you're, or I believe rather, I have to believe that when you're writing something, you express yourself inevitably, even if you're sort of highly constructed and like elaborate, and you're playing games or something, those games or those constructs like inevitably become part of how people see you and like who you are, I think. So if you're a genuine person who is never ironic, then that is just as much a true expression of yourself as someone who is extremely cynical and ironic and you can't get a like straight word out of them, right? That's who they are. And so from this idea, I was also thinking about the way people portray themselves online and on social media in particular, and the ways that the sort of obvious falsehoods and the obvious exaggerations and the obvious hyperboles inevitably like become quite quickly part of a person. So I think when we talk about social media, and this is sort of an old conversation about social media because it's so obvious and so well understood that we don't really need to say this anymore. We think that people are, they're doing a persona, they have a personal brand. There are all these ways that we need to talk about the way that people develop their characters online, right? And they treat themselves as characters and they use that to sell themselves in whatever way they want or need to. That may be because they are professional writers, or it may just be because they want followers and love and affection from strangers. And I was thinking about, there was always, this like, oh, well, that's not really who they are. But I started to feel, because I spent so much time online, that actually the fact that people do that does say something about who they are. And it is actually very important to sort of explore how that shapes people, because it's only doing so more and more. And I also think it does something very interesting, not just to the self, but also to the people around you, or to the reader in this case, or to the audience. So there's like a certain demand when you see people posting things on the internet that are ridiculous or absurd or sort of like too good to be true, that there's a demand that you interpret them and that you sort of bring many tools of interpretation to all interactions. Like you can't really take things for face value. And I was interested in sort of creating a character in fake accounts who also sort of demanded that kind of interpretation and does not let you just say, does not allow the reader to just say, oh, she's explaining who she is. She's giving me a certain number of qualities and now I understand her character very easily. I think that is, it sort of reflects like how we develop ourselves in the world anyway, right? Like it doesn't happen in a vacuum. We're just a sum of our influences and experiences, right? Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I don't remember the question, but it was fantastic.
I remember the question.
It is very, very scary to write about the self for exactly the reason that I think everyone is saying, which is, to quote the highly relevant 19th century psychologist William James, the self in our stream of consciousness changes continuously as it moves forward in time, even as we retain the sense that the self remains the same while our existence continues. So like, it is a conspicuously fictional thing to say I feel, right, in a poem, or to assert the I into a memoir as though it's stable. Like I know, Jenn, you were talking about how even as you were earlier, before this, even as you were revisiting the same archival material, you were noticing very different kind of understandings and responses to it. And like with social media, every time we like update the status or whatever, we're like re-signifying an identity that we're actually creating. It's a fiction, not that's responding to something that's there, because that's the scary thing. There's nothing really there we can put our hands on. Identity is ultimately a failure. So so the ways in which genre and fiction responds to that is so exciting to me. And to me that again, that's where I see the vitality in a lot of the work here. I have a really excellent question from one of the students here that points out something I hadn't really thought about, which is that all of you in your various ways seem to be filtering your experiences through another archive or tradition, placing yourself in history. So what kind of access to self does this process allow? So for instance, going through mythology or going through biography or archival research or social media, right? So what kind of, that kind of archival filtering that happens, what is that doing in terms of, again, it's kind of displacing the center of the self in a weird way. And I might ask, and that's a good question maybe for you to be going to, Maya, because of this, the way you do create all these different points of view in your book around this sort of central figure, and there is a kind of archival quality to that omniscient range.
Yeah, I think for me, it became a question then of form, and using that as a way to, as a structural foundation for the book. And, I talked about this a little bit before too. It's like placing myself becomes a kind of radical act too, that I am challenging the kind of viewpoint that those original stories were told in. And I mean that in terms of the distance of the speaker, of the narrator. And I mean that in terms of the actual demographics of it, that, me being a contemporary Black woman being placed in the structure of this kind of epic poem. And I think it's more interesting to me to do it that way, that I can use these different viewpoints to create the different facets of myself. Yeah, because I never consciously thought in writing the book that this is me revealing myself. Like, this was always supposed to be a book that was about loss and memorializing someone, and in so doing, as you both were saying, that's how you create the self for the reader. Even if it's an artificial self, it's still enough of the self that I feel like you get a sense of me in terms of my intentions as an artist. Like, what does it mean that I picked out this character? What does it mean that I picked out this character to speak from? And I don't know, I think it's really fun to as a writer, to be aware of the kind of artifice of the art form and to kind of nod to that. So I feel like in terms of some of the structures of my poems, like as the poem that is kind of like laid out like a scene of a play. Like that is me very much like kind of winking at the reader and being like, oh, look, like this is me consciously like inviting you into this perspective, this setting, and me being aware that this is, I'm setting up the dressings of this and inviting you in.
Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, this is interesting, like just listening to each of you and my own responses to these questions so far, like to think like maybe even in a feminist way about like, like this is a panel about like writing the self, and we're all like, but I was really writing about, so like we have some sort of like barrier that we built into the process, so that it's like ostensibly not about us. And I think like there are questions to like address. There are things we could like think about in therapy like about that. But at some point like during the last year, and I think this was actually in a conversation about the essays I've been writing, which are also like heavily research based, I was asked or I was told in an offhand way by, I don't remember if it was a friend or an editor, but they said something like, well, like you do all this research, but you're really like trying to understand yourself. Like that's why you do all the research. And I was like, ouch. Like that felt so rude. But I think it does, like it provides some sort of safety. It provides some sort of maybe like a shield from what feels vulnerable to explore these questions in some like exterior subject to the self, but then to use, at least in my case, in the case of my writing, like to use myself as a filter for that information, or to kind of show, to use myself as a lens, something like that. But yeah, like the research, the Carson McCullers of it all, there is certainly a way to read it as simply like a tool that I use to tell my own story. I don't know if I like that reading, and I don't know if I agree with it, but it's definitely something you could argue.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah, and I think the thing about the use of, I guess, social media would be the filter or the archival material, like the sort of live feed of news and commentary that is kind of the backdrop of fake accounts. I think the thing about it is that the narrator and I hate it and don't want to be attached to it, but we are, yes, and sort of like feeling it she feels it affecting her even as she wants to resist it, I think, and she's sort of compelled by it, and there are lots of reasons why people are compelled by social media, but I think one of them is that it feels like an escape from yourself in a certain way, but it also feels like a shortcut to identity formation and subject formation, which is usually, like lifetime long work, as we have discussed, but it sort of feeds you so many easy influences immediately that you can copy. And so you see the way that ideas move quickly through social media, the way that identities become very popular. Like you can have a trendy identity, you can have trendy things that you like. People develop these like new proclivities based on things that you can kind of like trends that you can kind of trace online. So I think the filtering mechanism is sort of complicated and not pleasant to think about a lot of the time, because in general, I think in fake accounts, a lot of the influences are sort of paltry or cliched or superficial. So if the narrator finds herself sort of mimicking things that she sees online, she's inevitably embarrassed by it, and she really doesn't like what that says about herself. And I think part of that is because she wants to be an original, like she wants to be an individual, and the way, the sort of impossibility of that is very evident, like when you can sort of watch everybody wanting to be an individual in the exact same way at the same time, which social media kind of allows you to do, right? So yeah, I like the question. And I also like thinking about it from a feminist perspective, as Jenn was mentioning, but because I think on the feminist internet, where I used to work for a feminist website, which is sort of represented in fake accounts, there was so much encouragement to like express yourself and to like take charge of your identity and to like be your own person and to sort of like arrive, right, in a way that the idea was that women could not be for. And it also created these cliches that people would copy and sort of these slogans that people would mimic, and then it becomes quite alienating, and it also becomes like, again, quite unoriginal, I think. So it's, yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, that's all really fascinating. And as I'm listening to all of you, I'm hearing kind of implicitly, and in some cases explicitly, this idea that maybe the resistance to writing about the self has to do with the fact that the sort of common languages that genre gives us to write about the self actually reveals some deeper cultural norms that we have to contend with first, maybe. Like, I mean, for instance, it's worth acknowledging, like in your book, Maya, the body, right, of the father is handled in a lot of different ways, as an absence, as a sort of a place that like legal documentation fills, as an object that his mother, right, addresses, and it's significant to write about a Black body, right, and very different than that book would be, say, if it were about the grief from a different perspective, from a more kind of central voice, and and a thematic, recurrent kind of thematic acknowledgement. And your book, Jenn's, is queer body, feminist women bodies get paved over in the canon, queer bodies get elided, and their subjective perspectives are elided, and almost irrecoverably so. I mean, what you have really is an absence. And so what does it mean then to create a space using a language that is designed almost by convention to deny that space? And then how do you have to break it? And like when we were talking yesterday, Lauren, you were talking a lot about David Foster Wallace, which is an interesting kind of like crossover into your book, Jenn. Talking about David Foster Wallace and his kind of maximalist style being really evident in how you write. And I think it's worth kind of like acknowledging it's significant that this book, that style is you're writing that style. When in the 90s, when we had like all these like weird big man brains writing these novels like David Foster Wallace and William T. Vollmann and Jonathan Franzen, which were writing these like sort of like postmodern browbeaters, it's significant that that was a really male space that was really dominant. So it's, I guess what I'm saying, you're occupying a kind of a sort of a mode or of language or an area that has a kind of historical denial of feminine subjectivity. So I guess what I'm honing in on is this question of what each of you, as you start to push against, I mean, we all push against genre when we write, but as you begin to push, what do you discover about the sort of inherited barriers that have come into that genre, and like how do you deal with those inherited barriers? Or are they really there? Or is there a genre, right? Or is it just kind of a case-by-case renegotiation of what the genre is?
I feel like with the epic poetry and in general those kind of mythic stories, it's a very masculine viewpoint. It's historically very much masculine, and there's this glorification of men, of the male heroes who are all pretty much assholes and just like terrible guys, terrible kind of toxic masculine figures who nowadays when you read those kind of texts in the classroom, you're like, oh God, Achilles, really? You're gonna be whining in your tent about that? But like, so I was like very aware of that when I was using that form, and I was thinking like, is this a problem? Because obviously my subject is, this complicated male character who I'm placing in the tradition of the tragic hero. And, you know, I wanted to complicate that, and I wanted to question that and see, like, why do we honor and glorify these figures, and like what else is behind kind of the exterior of that like great masculine figure. And I feel like I also felt the difference in my language, that I included the female perspectives because those were those were most interesting to me in those cases. Like there's a whole kind of series, a smaller series within about Persephone and Hades that are mostly in Persephone's voice. And I mentioned there's Medea and Circe, and I think Circe is one of the poems that is very much a lot of wordplay. There's a lot of like gaps in those. There's a lot of caesuros in those lines. And, you know, there's also the character of kind of like the other woman in the autobiographical element of the text, you know, the woman with the father character, and also the other woman in terms of like the type in literature. And so that's where we get Circe again. And those characters can speak in a freer way. And I found that really important to do, that they're not restrained by the same kind of language as the male characters that you would find in those traditional myths. And like that kind of, not that I'm actually doing the like actual the metered verse of the epic, because I don't feel like doing that, but I'm still in free verse, but there is a kind of replication of that style. There is the kind of, this starts with the invocation. There are the same kind of grandiose diction that you would find in the epic poetry. But with the women, as I said, I wanted to make a point of breaking them out of this very limited box that they're in those stories, and letting them free in a way that felt fun and mischievous and a little naughty. Like those poems are the ones that like are a little more explicit, are a little more, they have a little more attitude. And, you know, I felt like I wanted to do justice to that, because those women's voices aren't really represented in mythology as much. Sorry, that was a long answer. I ramble when I'm anxious.
Just keep going. I love it.
I like, what was it? Mischievous and a little naughty, something that was good. For thinking about this. And also, Achilles was so gay.
Yeah. But so positive.
Yeah, I think with like thinking about biography in particular, like I don't know if I would say it's like a very, I mean, having worked at a bookstore, I'll say that there are a lot more like doorstop biographies of men by men, cis men, than there are of other people, especially white men. But you know, I think that, you know, there are also, you know, plenty of biographies of other people. Like it's not as bad as it once was. But I think like inserting yourself into a biography is, even though other people have done it, even though I didn't like come up with this idea, as I was mentioning yesterday, it's still transgressive. It's still seen as problematic by some. And the example that comes to mind is I got one particularly bad review in a British newspaper, and it was basically, I didn't actually read it because I don't read any of the reviews, because I tried to once and it was like, it just kind of like washes over you. You have no idea what it's saying. It doesn't mean anything. So I didn't read that. But like, it was so bad that people on Twitter that I didn't even know like came to my defense. So I became aware of it. And so the gist of it, my understanding is that the reviewer was like, why is this book about Jenn? You know, like that was her problem with it, and that was her question. So kind of a bad faith review, kind of like not really understanding the premise, or not engaging with the premise, and saying like, I want a biography of this author, and I don't want this other person to insert themselves into the narrative. But in the biographies of Carson McCullers that exist, that are told from this kind of objective third person, you know, there's so much of her story and of the intimacies, specifically of her interpersonal relationships, her sexuality, but also like her body, her lived experience, her chronic illness, that are not dealt with, or that are made less important or diminished. And so, as I've said before, I felt like the way to address those things was to actually bring my own perspective into the frame. And for some, like, I just think the pushback in that review is revealing. Like, there are definitely people still trying to police that boundary, and that, you know, it was by writing about myself that I felt like I was able to bring the queer of it all to the forefront and to make that a more essential part of her story. But at the same time, like, without the reviewer saying, like, wow, actually, my understanding is that she did say something like this, like that it was my fixation on her sexuality and not anything true about her sexuality that the book was conveying. It's just a way to kind of continue to do what's always been done, which is to say those stories aren't the stories that we want to hear, you know, or that certain people don't want to hear. So we're gonna put those in a little box and say, you know, this is just self-indulgent or self-focused, and is not really engaging with the subject as we want to see them.
That's great. Thank you.
So I did read all my reviews. I felt like it was, I mean, you know, I say like, oh, I felt like it was a responsibility because I'm a critic, but also I was just interested in them because I'm a critic. And I honestly did not, I got all sorts of reviews, obviously, but I did not expect this sort of like thing that we were talking about yesterday, where I'm sort of maximalist. I feel like I'm influenced by David Foster Wallace. I feel like I'm really influenced by Philip Roth. I feel like I wanted to write that kind of like energetic, complicated, like postmodern, formally challenging kind of novel, but I wanted to write it about boyfriends, and I wanted to write it from like a woman's perspective. And I didn't think that people would misunderstand that, basically. Lots of it is like, not satirizing, but playing with sort of genres like, you know, the woman goes abroad to find herself, right? Like there's an eat, pray, love sort of element, but the narrator, fake accounts, goes abroad to obscure herself completely and become a compulsive liar. And I think one of my friends described the book as like a bad boyfriend novel where the bad boyfriend barely shows up, doesn't matter at all. And I thought that was quite funny, like even from a feminist perspective. But so few of the reviewers even wrote about the fact that it was a novel kind of about dating and about relationships, even though that is a sort of like main structure of it. And I thought it was quite interesting because I was wondering if maybe it seems like anti-feminist to do so. But there was also a strain of review that was about how the novel is very analytical. The novel is clearly the novel of a critic. The novel has many tangents and it doesn't have a plot. And like, in fact, they were sort of complaining about how, you know, the narrator never showed, or the narrator, but also me, there was sort of like a conflation of like Lauren Oyler and also the narrator doesn't show any vulnerability in this novel, which seemed to me something you would never say about a male author. You would just never say like, Philip Roth's not crying enough in this book, right? And I'm just rereading Leaving the Intuition Station by Ben Lerner, which is a very formative novel for me. We were talking about this yesterday also. And I'm very happy to say that it holds up and I think it's fantastic, but it makes me really sad because there's so many things that he also has a sort of analytical, critical perspective, like he's inserting like pages and pages of essays and tangents and digressions in the book, and nobody says that he's not being nobody said that he wasn't being vulnerable enough. I guess he does cry in the novel, but I cry, you know, there's crying in Fake Accounts as well. It's not as if there's no tears. So I'm glad that I didn't really anticipate this kind of response when I was working on the book because I really didn't. But it does make me like question a lot of assumptions now, I guess, about genre and about my approach to fiction writing anyway.
Yeah, it's always it's interesting to hear about these reviews too, because it shows how people think about genre and protect it almost unconsciously. Like there's like Tope Florin has this great essay, like can black writers write autofiction, right? Which is kind of similar to Kathy Parkham's The Avant-Garde of Poetry. I can't remember but basically both of them argue that the avant-garde writing done by people of color is never recognized as avant-garde writing, because the way in which avant-garde writing is defined in our culture tends to be pretty Eurocentric, and the writing by people of color or from marginalized backgrounds or by queer writers is often seen as like an artifact of their experience, a cultural experience, right? Rather than as a individual claiming of the form. And so and when you're talking about Atosha Station, leaving Atosha Station, I taught that book a few years ago, and my students hated it because they thought this guy was such a privileged jerk. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's what he's saying. That's what he's writing about. And so it's a genre thing, right? It's like terms of engagement that you're each renegotiating in pretty important ways are being resisted, and it's not because of the fact that they're overly experimental works or anything. It's just like there's certain things like the body, for instance, that it's still considered a pretty radical act to have the body in a work of writing in a real way, like to have the sexual body, the contingency of the body, to have bathroom breaks in your fiction, things like that. It's still considered a pretty radical act because genres hasn't figured out how to, deal with that stuff that like the, Cixous and the new narrative writers are kind of trying to, this embodiment that these writers are trying to sort of put in writing. Still seem, anyway, those thresholds are still there. I have more questions. I'm not exactly sure the format that you have in mind. Are we going to have audience folks?
Yeah, if you maybe want to do one more question, but then we'd love to leave some time for.
Well, why don't we go ahead and I guess maybe this is like a quick kind of aesthetic question, which is that this just comes out of the conversation that I was having with one of you earlier, which is that all of your works tend to kind of resist this idea of like forward narrative construction, or like in your case, Lauren, kind of almost parody it by having like a beginning, middle, end, or beginning, middle, backstory, climax section. But they all seem to operate out of like an aesthetic of accumulation, which is different than like the idea of like telling a story, right? In other words, you're sort of piling up more information, and it continues to produce meaning in a more gradual, associative way. What's the question, Maya? Do you think like as you were like piling poem upon poem or line upon line, do you feel like that creates a different kind of meaning than trying to sort of create direct statements or direct narratives about, say, grief or something like that?
Yeah, I was not super interested in that. Actually, the way I structured the book was I had like the poem titles and like the first and the last lines written on index cards, and I had the index cards all spread out on the table, and I just like changed around the chronology because the book starts with an erasure of the first couple lines of the Odyssey, and then I go right to, oh, the father's dead, and then I skip back to the beginning, like this is when he was born. So that's more interesting to me because it's kind of like, first of all, it's more, I think it's more reflective of our experience of people. That is not, there's nothing like chronological about the way we experience people and memories. And it's also like that bit of dramatic tension, it's like skipping to the last page of the book and then starting at the beginning of the story. Like that's how, and then drawing the rest of the characters in along the way. It was really tricky, actually. I reorganized the book several times, but I I feel like there's a tension there that creates that really kind of draws the reader through.
My process is similar to what you're describing with the index cards and moving things around. Like I always, within the McCullers book, within my essays, I have a tendency to cut things up and lay them out on the floor at a certain point and then rearrange. And with this book, I was in particular like really resistant to some of the conventions of a biography. And I should say, like, I love biographies, like all the juicy gossip lives in the biographies. We should definitely still read those. But I was really resistant to like Carson McCullers was born in, like, or like her grandparents, starting in this very, the way almost all biographies begin, even if there's like a little lyrical something at the beginning, then they're gonna give you this completely chronological attempt at telling a life story, and that doesn't make any sense to me. Like exactly what you were saying, Maya. That's not how our experience feels, and that's not how. I just don't know if that's how we can even understand another person's life, especially when a lot of what's discussed in those beginning chapters they may not even remember. But so for me, though, I'm thinking about this idea of accumulation. You mentioned that earlier this morning. I'm thinking about it. Like, I actually didn't feel like an archive, like when a person's life, an archive, it feels like a huge pile of stuff to me. And there was like so much information about Carson McCullers, her materials, things that have been written that I'm like sifting through, often physically sifting through masses, like huge piles of paper. And so for me, it felt less like a process of accumulating this material and more a process of sifting through it, of distilling it, of condensing it, of paring it down to like a few really salient moments of discovery that I had in the archive, and a few like salient moments of her life that seemed really significant for the story I was telling. And then once I had those moments, it was a process of finding the arrangement of those that was not chronological, but that still could make sense to a reader, and that was that I was in some way able to allow the reader to come along with me to have these same discoveries. So like, how do you kind of build that suspense in, build some of the disjointedness and the fragmentation. I was especially interested in using the white space between chapters to kind of point at the absence, to point at what was missing, to point at the parts that I couldn't fill in, right? And then from there to create a shape with that, but that was certainly not a chronological shape.
I mean, did you also find, I guess this is what you're talking about with salient moments, but like with the kind of, me arranging the poems in my collection, I found like, I tried a system of doing like mini arcs and like finding those kind of like, oh, here's where we discovered this, or this is where we have this theme. And then those all come together into like a larger picture.
Yeah.
So, and yeah. I find that you don't really get that same thing, or it's not as dynamic if you do it in a kind of like more traditional structure. Would you say that? Like,
no, I agree with that. Yeah. And then I was always trying to, like, with each additional piece, figure out like, what do you need to know before this, like to understand it, but also like, what do I want you to not know yet?
Yeah, exactly.
Like, what do I want to kind of hold back and keep you in suspense about? To create. I like that. Those mini arcs.
That's awesome. Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, I was thinking about like layers of narrative modes as well, but I feel that the narrator figure counts is sort of like grabbing at the ways she's trying to find some way out of her situation, out of her alienation, out of her feeling of like futility and helplessness of being trapped in this kind of like mediatized environment. And I think of the book as her sort of like reaching for different, like trying different modes of narration, or like trying different like strategies for getting out of this, for like trying to understand this. So she's often doing things that she says that she hates doing. So she goes to the Women's March, even though she thinks it's stupid. There's 40 pages of fragmented prose in the sort of style of Maggie Nelson or Jenny Offal, that she also says that she hates, that she then sort of like tries out, attempting to like understand why it is that everybody is insisting that this is the way for a woman to narrate a novel. And so I think it creates this kind of like multifaceted experience that contributes to the feeling of like overwhelm that I wanted to, not overwhelmed, but like close to overwhelming. Like it seems like something's got to give, and then it eventually does, but not what you expect. But the way that I wrote it, or the way that I started thinking about it, was I was thinking about how you would tell the story that she's telling to a friend. So like, how would you gossip about this? And at least when I'm gossiping about things, I always like go off on a tangent, and I'm like, oh, I have to tell you about this first. I have to give you the backstory in just a second. Like I have to do this. And so it creates this kind of like, I don't know if it is like an accumulation of detail, and accumulation of narrative, and accumulation of stories. But also I think they branch it even as it's moving chronologically forward, it's sort of branching outward as well.
That's awesome. Do we have any time left, Eleanor?
Maybe for one question.
Yeah, one question. Yes.
Yeah, so Lauren, I like what you mentioned with thinking about how people portray themselves in the real world through these other mediums like social media, and kind of asking that question of how do these exaggerations become real? And I kind of want to put that into conversation to what you said, Maya, about kind of using the self to invite the reader into these like settings and contexts that feel kind of unique to you. And so this is kind of a question for all of you. When you are inviting the reader into these settings that you're making, do you feel yourself exaggerating yourself? And if so, do you feel that you kind of lose part of yourself in doing that, or do you gain something from it?
Should I go first? I think that I definitely gain. I feel like I gain from that process. I don't feel. I guess I never felt like myself as precious, right? Like I'm one of billions of people on this earth. And like if other people can do it, which is sort of like live and experience influences and stuff, and so can I. And because I think by virtue of making art or writing a novel, rather than just kind of being a reality TV star, let's say we can juxtapose those two careers, novelist, reality TV star. The novelist is the point of writing a novel, the point of making art is to have agency, right? So what it does to me is it makes me feel quite empowered or liberated to use myself, because I'm doing it in a way that I understand and that I can manipulate freely, rather than I don't know, going on TV because I'm desperate to be famous and like I need to be, I need attention or whatever. And obviously I do need attention, but it's a particular kind of attention that I want. So I have to like artfully go about it, as opposed to just like, like going to move into the real world house or whatever, if you even know what the real world house is. But yeah, I think it paradoxically like requires or enforces and teaches you to feel quite secure in yourself by doing that, because otherwise you would probably get lost.
That's a great question. So I think that before I wrote this book, it took me a few years to kind of attack the subject, and I was writing a couple really bad, like my dad is dead poems. And I feel like writing this book I lost something in a nice way. Like I lost the kind of, not just the burden of the grief, but the burden of having that subject like come up repeatedly in my work, and me not having a handle on it. And then with this book actually being like, oh, okay, I have a handle on this. And it's also, I created a kind of more digestible, more accessible version of my family and my family's story in the book. And that's helpful to me just personally.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm able to see that reflected in people who get back to me and say that like they get something from the book too. So like even in the degree of loss there, like the loss of, because you never actually like lose your grief. Like there's always that kind of absence there, but losing the version of you that is like actively grieving, as opposed to having it kind of in the background of your life as you go through your everyday, like even that loss feels like a gain for me, the way that this book functions, if that makes sense.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
Thinking about loss in particular. I feel like I don't have that much control over how I portray myself. I think I'm suspicious of this idea that we can portray a particular version of ourselves even in social media. Like I think social media wants us to think that we could do that and that we can have this persona, but like things that maybe we don't want people to know still find their way to leak through that. And certainly when you're writing about yourself, like you may think you've got it all under control and I'm only revealing these particular details, but every word I choose is revealing something about me. It's revealing something about my background, about what I've read, about my influences, about the way I think. And even the way I answer this question is revealing quite a bit that like maybe I don't actually want to share with you right now. So I don't know. I feel like there's a lot of vulnerability that like in that process and in the process of writing about yourself or writing about anything really that we don't have a whole lot of control over. I had another part to say about that, but then I got lost. So I'm gonna end there.
Knowing how to not have control. Well, thank y'all all three very much, Lauren, Jenn, and Maya. That was really exciting to listen to, and thank you all for staying.
Thank you so much, Jacob. That was really a wonderful conversation. Thank you to the three of you, and thanks everybody for being here. I hope you'll come back for our 2:00 panel with the rest of our writers on performing gender in theater and cinema, and then back here at a reading at 5:00. Hope to see you then.